episodes of these that we've done in the past. So each of our speakers will have a few introductory comments, and then we'll go to your questions. To fill out a question, use the panel at the bottom, the Q&A panel, type your question, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. First up is Dr. Jacob Shively.
All right, well, glad that you're all with us this evening. What I thought I would do is focus a little bit more on my area of expertise, which is U.S. grand strategy. So kind of a big approach and with a focus on Trump 1, Biden, and where are we at with Trump 2, very briefly, and then a few comments about how I think Trump is approaching things this year, and then the others can get a little into a little more detail. So I was thinking about a comparison in particular between Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. For various reasons that I won't get into, I have a theory that Reagan kind of represents the beginning of a political consolidation, and Trump represents the end of that era and maybe a reconsolidation around something else, particularly for Republicans. And if you compare the way they talked about foreign policy, it's actually quite different, even though they're both very conservative in their own way. The classic comparison would be in Reagan's farewell address, where he says, "I have quoted the words of John Winthrop, one of the founding colonialists in New England. I've quoted the words of John Winthrop, delivered to the little band of pilgrims on the tiny ship Arbella in 1630. We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." So this idea of a city on a hill was a kind of ideal where the United States represented democracy, anti-communism at the time in the Cold War, and a number of other values. Basically, I think now we could say a kind of internationalism, but a conservative version of internationalism. If you look at Trump, the way Trump talks about American foreign policy, for instance, in his inaugural this year, he said, and I'm not going to do the voices for either of these guys, I'm sorry, but you can hear them in your mind. America will reclaim its rightful place as the greatest, most powerful, most respected nation on earth, inspiring the awe and admiration of the entire world. In his first term, he also talked a lot about we've been suckers for so long, other countries are laughing at us, right? So I think both of those statements give you the range of the way Trump talks about U.S. foreign policy. And I would say that the difference between those is Trump is moving toward nationalism more than internationalism in his approach. You'll notice the focus on that second quote is about our rightful place as the greatest, most powerful, whereas Reagan is talking about being an example, right? A city on a hill. So it's a slightly different framing, but you start to get a sense of how Trump has shifted the party, the GOP. Briefly, I would say, to define my terms a little bit, when I say internationalism, I mean focus on institutions, that post-World War II environment that the United States established decades ago and maintained for a long time, especially through the Cold War. Focus on democracies, international integration, what we would call in international relations a positive sum view of the world, that if we grow, if we integrate, that'll be good for everybody else too, right? By contrast, Trump's nationalist approach is more focused on national sovereignty, a phrase he liked to use a lot in his first term, right? Everybody should just do their own thing. We're all sovereign and we need to respect that. There's an element of anti-elitism, whereas internationalism tends to be a little more elitist, maybe. He's focusing on doing deals with separate countries rather than some broad integrated approach to the world. And he's willing to work with kind of anybody who will do deals with him specifically, rather than in his own personal affinity with people and leaders, rather than a kind of we focus on and prioritize democracies. A prioritization on American national culture, who we are as a people. A lot of talk about that. Reagan talked, of course, in those terms, but it was more like we're one among many, and Trump is saying, well, we have to be very protective of who we are. Again, slightly different, but you can see how that can create big differences. And then finally, where internationalism is positive sum, this more nationalist approach is zero sum. If someone else is gaining, we're probably losing, right? We're laughing at us, like he said in that earlier quote. So the shift, I argue, is from internationalism, particularly in the GOP in this case, to nationalism. Now, Trump won, kind of moved down the road, kind of moved down this path a little bit, but they didn't get all the way there. Partly because Trump brought in a lot of old familiar Republicans, what we might call old guard Republicans or Reagan Republicans, that type of thing. So some of them were realists, some of them were, concerned about American power and so forth and protecting U.S. sovereignty, but they still wanted to maintain their relationship with NATO. They still wanted like big trade integration and that type of thing. And a lot of Trump's more nationalist advisors tended to win some of the fights, lose some of the fights. But you could see over his first term, a lot of those folks were gaining more ground, and he was kind of weeding out the more conventional, the traditional Republicans, if you will. Now Biden comes in, and his whole thing is we're back to internationalism, and I won't get into that whole story. That's a different discussion. But he was able to do that nominally. In other words, he changed the way Americans talked about foreign policy, but he didn't actually change the way at least half of Americans think about foreign policy. Right? There was still this strong pro-Trump strain, and a lot of those folks were more skeptical of the Biden approach. Now Trump 2 comes in. And basically, they're probably in a more powerful position than they would have been if he had been directly reelected in 2020, because they've had 4 years to plan out what are they going to do with the American bureaucracy, what are they going to do in foreign policy. He's got a whole bevy of people he's going to appoint. He doesn't have to worry about finding foreign policy people that don't quite agree with him, but they've got the experience. So they come in, and as we all know, domestically, there's a lot of upheaval, if from one perspective, or a lot of dramatic change and adaptation from a different perspective. But in any case, American foreign policy bureaucracy has been radically reshaped. They haven't been able to dump a lot of bureaucratic offices, because Congress has to do that. But they unwound USAID, which was a pretty large marker of change. The argument I would make, and this is partly for my dissertation, is that the George W. Bush administration looked like they were making dramatic change, but never quite did. They were never interested in really revolutionizing American foreign policy. Whereas with Trump, I think we're much closer to that than we have been in decades. If not the 1930s, then maybe 1947, when the Congress passes the National Security Act, create the Department of Defense. Trump wants to rename the Department of Defense the Department of War, right, as a clear signal of where he's going. So all of this change, weeding out a lot of people from the bureaucracy, dissolving agencies, moving money around, is all indicative of where Trump is going. I've got a lot more I could say, but I'll just give you one example here. There's a story in The Economist, I think from last week, where they tracked where the money from USAID went. So most of us assumed, all right, they unwound USAID, which was humanitarian support around the world, medical, food, that type of thing. They got rid of it, and that's a whole interesting story in itself. And we just assume the money kind of, I guess, dissolves back into the Treasury. But in fact, Congress had designated it to be used for foreign aid in some form. So what they've started to do is treat it as loans to different countries. So for instance, Argentina, right? Famously, they've directed billions of dollars to stabilize the Argentinian currency. They're looking at other types of loans in the mold of China in previous decades, or over the last 10, 15 years, in approaching African countries, for example. Like, here's some money. Will you give us access to our resources? So it seems that the Trump administration may be looking at rearranging U.S. aid from that more old Cold War 20th century model of just a humanitarian internationalist focus to more specific investments, if you will, or identifying leaders we like and trying to help them out of a scrape, that type of thing. So it's a shift, not unwinding Americans' power in the world, but narrowing it in a way. So overall, my argument is that the Trump administration is dramatically different than any administration we've seen, the second Trump administration in particular, than any administration we've seen since the 1940s, because all of those administrations had been shaped by the experience of World War II and the Cold War, and the concept that the Americans have to be deeply invested in the world. And the Trump administration seems to be rearranging that, right? They are less convinced about that type of commitment, and they interpret American interests in very different ways. So we can talk more about that in more detail, but hopefully that's a nice overview that gets you thinking about questions.
Thank you, Dr. Shively. Next up, we have Dr. Elvis Kim.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me in this discussion on American foreign policy. My remarks will focus on U.S.-China relationships, so my expertise is more in China. More specifically, I will talk about the overarching diplomatic strategies of both countries, U.S. and China, as well as the domestic politics that fundamentally shape those strategies. Much of the conversation in foreign policy has centered on how the United States manages the China challenge, right? But to fully understand the evolving and complex bilateral relationships, we have to have a better understanding of the domestic politics in the two countries. Because we know, we learn in IR class, foreign policy is a two-level game, right? A concept developed by Robert Putnam. International politics always interacts with domestic politics, and foreign policy makers on the international stage, they are constrained by domestic political forces because it is domestic constituencies that gave the leaders the power in the first place. Trump, in his second term, has become more powerful now compared to his first term because he won the election with overwhelming popular support, with Republicans controlling the Congress at the same time. I'm not a foreign policy expert, but in the United States, I do see some continuities in terms of the overarching diplomatic strategies in the second term under Trump's leadership. First, again, it's American first, as Dr. Shively has mentioned, with a strong emphasis on U.S. sovereignty, also national interest. But national interest, we know, can be defined differently by different leaders in different historical periods. So right now, national interest is more defined in a nationalist and sometimes protectionist manner. For example, centering on domestic security, economic self-reliance, minimizing international commitments that are viewed as a burden to the United States. Second feature I see is diplomacy is often transactional under Trump's leadership. More deals and alliances are evaluated based on often quantifiable costs and benefits, rather than obeying long-standing ideological principles or working through multilateral institutions like Dr. Shively just mentioned. So allies are expected to contribute more, whether financially or in military terms. Actually, there are lots of similarities between China's foreign policy approach and America's foreign policy approach. Now they are focused much less on ideologies and values, but more like pragmatic and nationalistic. Well, how to understand that? Well, I think these strategies are grounded in American domestic politics, right? Trump won popular support by campaigning with a populist platform. We know populism has two essential features. First, society is divided into two homogeneous groups, right? Pure people versus corrupt elite. So populism is both anti-elitist and nationalist at the same time, oftentimes. So distrust of the elite by the people is based on the perception that the elite is not only corrupt, but also favor foreign interests. That's a current narrative now. Well, then who are these elites, right? They can include basically like democratic politicians, bureaucrats, liberal media, intellectual, or whoever doesn't support the agenda. Second feature of populism, we know politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. Well, so people here, again, is exclusive, is exclusionary, is not a universal concept. So for populists, only some of the people are the real people. where others are not real people, right? So it's not a phenomenon in the United States, but around the world. Immigrants may not be the real people, or religious minorities, not the real people, political opponents, not the real people, right? And second key term is the general will, which doesn't exist, right? Because in politics, people always disagree, especially in a large society like the United States or China. So majority will at the best, but they frame it as a general will of the people. Again, both the term of general will and the term people are not inclusive. They are actually exclusionary. Now, why we see this phenomenon of rising populism around the world, right? Not just here in the US. In China as well, there is a lot of populist rhetorics. So, well, there are both economic as well as cultural factors behind these. So during the past 35 years, economic growth continued, but economic inequality also increased around the world, especially in the developed countries, developed democracies. So the less educated working class, they are actually experiencing declining economic security. So during a time of crisis and hardship, many desire a strongman leader who can speak for them and defend their interests. So this, plus large immigration flows and radical cultural changes, kind of provoke a reaction in which much of the working class moved to the conservative from the left to the right in defense of traditional values. So the cleavage structure in many developed countries has become more and more cultural rather than economic. So many working class Americans, they feel like they have become strangers in their own land because of increased economic insecurity as well as radical cultural changes. So from China's perspective, this has reinforced like corresponding responses. First, China has accelerated economic and technological self-reliance because of US containment. Second, China has deepened engagement with Global South as a means of counterbalancing Western influence. So that's like the general, these are like the specific responses, then how to understand where these foreign policy approaches come from, right? So we need to first identify China's core interests. Again, domestic legitimacy always comes first because that's how leaders stay and maintain their power. So what constitutes the core legitimacy for China, for Chinese leaders, for CCP? First, economic performance since the 1980s, also political stability, right? Third, has become increasingly important, which is nationalism. So it's very similar with the US. So the second core interest of China is territorial integrity, right? So because these are part of Chinese government's sovereign claims like South China Sea, Taiwan, Diaoyu Island disputed with Japan, also Tibet, Xinjiang with ethnic minorities, and Hong Kong. So these are important, first because they are tied to domestic legitimacy. Second, they are important because it's perceived as historical mission that needs to be carried out by the CCP, right? National unification is not finished yet. That's why Beijing is very insistent on their sovereign claims and territorial integrity. Well, lots of people talk about like global and regional leadership of China. Well, in my opinion, this is not like the primary concern. It's more of a secondary, serving the other core interests. So because in the past several decades, since the 1980s, China has benefited from regional stability, right, in East Asia, which is essential to economy, economic growth, and maintaining security. So in terms of global and regional leadership, I see China's approach is more defensive rather than aggressive, as long as it is not related to the core interests, right? Like those I mentioned, South China Sea, Taiwan, Diaoyu Island, or Tibet and Xinjiang. So yeah, I mentioned like China, nationalism is a key source of legitimacy. So the general approach of foreign policy, so Dr. Shively mentioned in Trump's second term, there is a structural or strategic shift in terms of grand strategy in US foreign policy. I think in China, similar things have been happening as well, right? So since 1980s, after Mao, China has focused on development, right, economic growth. So the priority was to integrate with the world market. But since the 2008, China has become increasingly assertive and aggressive, sometimes to defending their national interests, right? So yeah, there is a fundamental strategic shift in Chinese foreign policy approach as well. It's more and more nationalistic. Well, she mentioned this new era for China. So he said, in Mao's China, right, the Mao made China independent, right, from imperial power like Japanese. And then the leader in 1980s made China prosperous, right? He started economic reforms, reintroduced the market system. And now, under President Xi, so it is a new era. China will be great again. But that's very similar with Americans' approach. Of course, the bottom line, even though the two have very different political system, but the bottom line, again, is like CCP leadership needs to be maintained. That's the bottom line. She also talks about Chinese dream. Well, American dream is more of like individualistic, right? If you work hard, there can be social mobility, but Chinese dream is more of a nationalistic dream, right? Restoring China's formal glory, historical prominence. That is Chinese dream. That includes economic prosperity, social harmony, military strength, and cultural confidence as well. We can talk about more about this if you have questions. So the last thing I want to conclude with like why Chinese politics and foreign policy matter, even though today the title is American foreign policy. China's foreign policy is because China's foreign policy is a defining force in global politics, right? Shaped by a mix of historical legacies, economic interests, national security priorities, as well as strategic vision of the leadership. And China, as the world's second largest economy and a major military power, Chinese foreign policy affects international trade, diplomacy, and security across the world. So because of that, U.S.-China relation today is probably one of the most important bilateral relations in the world. So I will stop here. I look forward to exploring these themes further in our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. All right, Dr. Crisher, you're up.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here tonight. Just a reminder, when I'm done, we'll go ahead and start taking questions. So if you've got that burning question about American foreign policy, make sure you get that in the Q&A box so we can go ahead and answer those questions. So my focus for my comments are going to be on U.S.-Chinese relations. And an area in which I agree with the Trump administration is the need for the U.S. to improve its trade position vis-a-vis China. The trade imbalance between the country is problematic. It's been problematic for years, and the U.S. overall is too dependent on Chinese imports. Furthermore, I think more importantly, the U.S. is too dependent on importing rare earth minerals from China. And this is not just an economic problem, this is a national security problem. And our vulnerability to this dependency is becoming apparent again. So if you haven't been keeping up on the news, a couple of days ago, China announces restrictions on the export of rare earth minerals outside of the country and tighter controls on exporting goods that make use of rare earth minerals. This is bad for the US. And Trump responds with a 100% increase of tariffs on Chinese goods. The stock market reacts in a way in which you would think stocks take a big hit, and they have been steadily declining since. And it's important to keep in mind, this is not the first time that China has restricted the flow of rare earth minerals into the US. They did something similar, although not to this extreme, back in April in response to that sort of first volley of tariffs that Trump launches during Liberation Day. But the US and China were able to sort of very quickly come to a deal, and it seemed like everything was fine. But China learned something from this incident. It learned the US was actually fairly sensitive to the flow of rare earth minerals, and China finds out we've got leverage over the US on an important item. And so we're sort of seeing them pull that lever here again. And it shows that the US is too dependent on China for these minerals. But there's a problem. The problem is China's about the only game in town if you want rare earth minerals. They have a huge monopoly on the market. Something like 90% of the world's rare earth minerals come from China. This is an oversight of US policy, and it's been an oversight of US policy for the last, decade or so of sort of dealing with this problem. And rectifying that problem is not going to be easy. Rare earth minerals, despite the name, they're not that rare. There's plenty of them out there, but they're really, really hard to get to. In terms of mining these things, they're very difficult, and it involves a great deal of environmental destruction. So increasing production in the US is going to mean reducing some environmental regulations. It's probably going to mean a hefty amount of government investment as well. So in other words, it's going to take time, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be dirty. So on the whole, I agree with the administration. It's reducing US dependency on these is important, it's crucial. And when we think of sort of the emerging, growing competition between the US and China, right, it's important for us to sort of remove this lever from China. The problem, I think, arises is when we start to look at the US approach to foreign policy under Trump 2.0, and Dr. Shively and Dr. Kim has already sort of hit on this point. I don't think the US approach has been very well executed up to this point. The US needs to start thinking more long-term. And thinking long-term is going to mean increasing ties with friendly nations to be able to pool resources and coordinate policies to push back against China. The problem is our primary foreign policy tool right now is tariffs. And we're more or less tariffing everybody except for Russia in the hopes of trying to get some sort of short-term gain out of the tariffs. And yeah, we have gotten some short-term gains, but the long-term effects of pursuing foreign policy this way can be very, very detrimental. In the long run, these tariffs they're just going to hurt US relations with nations that we can be depending upon to help us in a competition with China. These nations, they will start looking for other partners to hedge against unpredictable US policies, or worse, some of these nations, particularly ones in the region, will just turn to China instead, right? If they're forced to pick between the US and China, you might start getting some nations just going with China. And we're seeing evidence of this already. It looked like US and Indian relations were doing great under Biden. It looks like we had sort of a new era. India traditionally has tried to be neutral in these things, but it seemed like they were coming over more on the American side. And then Trump 2.0, they get hammered with tariffs. They're getting criticized for their relations with Russia. And now Modi is seemingly sort of trying to make up a bit with China, as they're trying to sort of hedge who they're going to sort of follow in the future. And the US insistence on tariffs and the sort of more transactional approach to diplomacy risks leaving the US in isolation, precisely at the moment it needs all friends it can get. If we look at relations with Europe here in the last couple months, through coercion and threats, Europe has agreed to increase the defense spending to 5% of GDP, which is pretty impressive. That's great. That's a good thing. Europe has been free riding for too long. That's a good thing. But if you continue the tariffs, if you continue the threats, Europe might start to pursue policies that gives them more independence from the US, which means the US becomes even more isolated in this potential competition with China. And as Dr. Shively noted, right, dismantling US aid, reducing foreign aid abroad has limited, weakened US soft power, and we've seen China trying to fill that vacuum as they give out more money in these regions where the US is no longer or is operating at a much lower level. So a better solution, I think there's a better solution here, a more potentially effective solution. If you want to keep the tariffs, by all means, keep the tariffs against China. That's fine. Go ahead and do that. And also start creating new supply chains, particularly for these rare earth metals. I would argue sanctions are better than tariffs, but I'll take organized tariffs at this point. But stop or greatly reduce those tariffs against countries that we need to help us compete against China. We can put together mutually beneficial trade agreements. We can maybe help address some of the concerns with the trade deficits that President Trump is concerned about. Although even in that regard, we're going to have to understand and acknowledge that we're going to have trade deficits with smaller countries. Mathematically and economically, that's just the way it is. You tend to not run a trade surplus with countries that are much smaller than you. So the Trump administration is correct. Competition with China is of crucial importance for the US moving forward. And when I say competition, right, economic, strategic, this does not necessarily need to be military competition. But the US needs to understand this is a long-term competition, much like what we saw in the Cold War, which was also long-term competition. And then maybe stop focusing so much on short-term gains, right? Sort of policies that only bring us short-term gains, start to play that long game again. Reaching out for short-term gains. This has exposed some of our weaknesses in some of these crucial areas, and it's starting to alienate the very countries we'll need on our side to emerge victorious. So sort of as a sort of wrap up, right, I agree with the Trump administration in a few areas of foreign policy, but I think how they go about trying to make it happen is where we start to run into some of the problems, and for some of those reasons that Dr. Shively and Dr. Kim talked about. So I'll keep it relatively brief so we can get to some Q&A.
All right, thank you, Dr. Crisher. Our first question deals with the problem of Taiwan, or the issue of Taiwan. If there were to be a military invasion, if China were to attempt to recapture Taiwan, maybe let's ask it on two levels. First, what would America's response likely be? Would America have to send in boots on the ground? Is that the kind of commitment we would make? But maybe, especially if it happens during Trump's second term, is there a difference between how maybe the military establishment would advise a president and what Trump himself would be likely to do in the event of an invasion?
I'm going to go ahead and jump in first. This is a really good question. It's a really interesting question. And if you would have asked this question to me a couple of years ago, one of the things I would have said is, this is just one of those hypotheticals that's, we shouldn't even worry about it too much. But at this day and age, actually, this is a very valid question and something we do need to sort of think through. Because when we're talking about China ramping up its military, one of the things they've been very focused on the last couple of years, roughly the last decade or so, is increasing their amphibious capabilities. Right, so it's not just that the Chinese Navy has greatly expanded. They've also expanded their amphibious capabilities, which now means they are either at or very close to having the ability to cross the Taiwan Straits to actually be able to launch military sort of boots on the ground inside of Taiwan. And I think in terms of their naval development here in the last couple of years, that is a very, very underappreciated aspect of Chinese military development. Now, in terms of the question itself, I'll focus more on, what might the U.S. response be rather than what the military recommends. And right, by law, the U.S. must come to the aid of Taiwan if this were to occur by law. But we don't know what that exactly means. It's not clear what aid means. Is it just open up the checkbook? Do we just put the Navy in close proximity to Taiwan? Do we put boots on the ground? Yes or no? It's sort of unclear. My guess, no boots on the ground. That's not going to happen. I would highly doubt that the U.S. would put boots on the ground over Taiwan, and you probably would see naval assets in the area. I think in terms of active support, you would most likely see naval assets, although I don't know how willing we are to risk, the new Ford class aircraft carriers when we're not sure how effective these, ballistic anti-ship missiles are. I think there would definitely be money flowing, aid flowing, but as far as active military participation, I'm not too sure. And I'll let Dr. Kim or Dr. Shively jump in.
Yeah, I can add to Dr. Crisher's comments. In recent years, China's military capacity has increased dramatically. So one core mission for the Chinese military is to take back Taiwan. So U.S.-China's foreign relation is established on the One China principle, but as Dr. Crisher pointed out, it's very vague. The language is actually ambiguous. So basically, U.S. will recognize only one China, but it doesn't say like which China, People's Republic of China or Republic of China, which is Taiwan. Legally, U.S. Is obligated to intervene if the military conflict arises, if the status quo is disrupted. But another thing U.S. has to consider is international credibility, right? If China invades Taiwan and U.S. does not intervene, it will probably undermine the trust of allies in the United States. Also, China is closely observing how U.S. has responded to Ukraine-Russia conflicts, right? So see like how not just U.S. but also like Western Europe, how they responded to when Russia invaded Ukraine. I think even though in terms of capacity, it is increasingly possible China may militarily invade Taiwan, but in terms of economic costs or social costs, right? Again, I believe like domestic legitimacy is still the major concern. China right now is facing a lot of domestic problems, right? The economy is not doing so great. China has trying to increasing domestic consumption within the Chinese market, but because especially since COVID, the employment has been down and the economy is not growing as fast as before, and China is trying to creating a welfare state as well, then it also has an aging population problem. So fighting a war will be very costly, right? So we know in historical cases, leaders always thought war can end quickly, but that almost never the case. So it's gonna be cost a lot. It's gonna be a lot of cost for China. So I don't think that's a decision that will be taken lightly on the Chinese side. Even though military, as an organization, the Chinese military, they will prefer a more aggressive approach. But from the leadership of the CCP's perspective, they will probably be more cautious. But without any kind of extreme change in the external environment, I don't see that as an immediate possibility.
I'll add just a little bit here. Apparently, IR people have opinions about Taiwan, but I'll play out the question about Trump specifically. So it matters who the president is. It didn't used to matter if China. Well, we'll just posit the scenario where, and I think Dr. Kim is right. Basically, the Chinese would be very careful. They're not like Putin. They're much less likely to overestimate their ability to just seize Taiwan and get away with it, and they have every right to do that. I mean, they might think they have every right, but basically they're less delusional than Putin was in invading Ukraine. So I'm maybe a little more skeptical than Dr. Crisher that we would see an invasion or that there's something like that imminent. But it is still, a real scenario. Anyway, up until Trump's first term, I think it was pretty much agreed that if Taiwan was invaded, and the starting conditions may matter a little bit, but basically any American president would defend Taiwan. In fact, Biden said that explicitly. It was usually unspoken, but he was prone to bluntness, and he was a creature of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, right? He had a formative experience at the height of the Cold War, and for him there was no question, right? We would defend Taiwan in a similar way that he approached Israel, I think. But I think it would be more of a he probably would be more comfortable devoting military assets. Trump, however, is not wedded to Taiwan. He doesn't really see the point in the same way. He doesn't think in geostrategic terms exactly the same way as prior administrations. And he's not so concerned that, Taiwan's a democracy and we need to defend it. But I do think he would be very concerned, as Dr. Kim said, about reputation, his reputation in particular, and he would not be comfortable just letting it go. And you can kind of see this playing out a little bit with Ukraine. He thought, I can come in, make a deal with the Russians, they'll see reason. And then when they didn't, he's been increasingly supportive of continuing aid to the Ukrainians and not completely pulling back like he'd initially thought, because he doesn't want to come off looking like he failed. So if Taiwan is attacked by the Chinese, I think as an individual leader, he would probably be motivated to do something, and maybe along the lines of what Dr. Crisher was saying. But the moment matters. How it was done, how it's likely to play out. All those factors matter. So bottom line, I think there would be some U.S. response, but it would be less basically under a Trump administration than, say, a Biden administration, is my read.
And I want to jump back in here. So to be clear, my position was where a couple of years ago, a potential threatened invasion of Taiwan by a Chinese government, a couple of years ago, it would have been an empty threat. And I think today the threat is much less empty. Now, I don't think it's imminent, and I think Dr. Kim and Dr. Shively is right. I don't think it's imminent. And I think one of the things that is helpful for us to sort of keep in mind is, yes, China has all of these new lovely military toys. They're shiny, they look good, they sound good, all that sort of stuff. Having the capabilities and understanding how to use them are two very, very different things. And China has not fought anything approaching major military action since the late 1980s when they dealt with Vietnam. That's a long time ago. It's been a long time. And so, yeah, now they have a couple carrier strike groups. Do they know how to use them? Do they know how to use them in wartime? Can they coordinate with land forces in order to make them more effective? These are things we simply don't know. And the Chinese don't even know. So I do think in terms of Taiwan, it's not imminent. And if China were to engage in military action here in the future, I don't think it would be in Taiwan. I think they would do something elsewhere and use that as sort of a training run, dry run, sort of figure out how to make these things work before they went and then tried to do anything with Taiwan. Because as Dr. Kim has noted, right, they're looking at what's happened in Ukraine. And what we've found out is you can do some serious damage to naval assets, even if you don't actually have a navy. And I can imagine for China that would give them a great deal of pause. So yeah, much like the Germans had their dry run in the Spanish Civil War prior to the outbreak of World War II, I think China would do something similar before jumping into conflict with Taiwan. But again, that threat is much more significant and real than it was 5-10 years ago. That's kind of the point.
Dr. Crisher, you'd mentioned the need to maybe calibrate the tariffs and be nice to friends because we're not going to make everything we need here, and it's good to have trade partners and military partners, friends. If for each of you, if you're thinking about what makes a friend of the United States, what's at the top of the list? What are the things that aren't? Is it really as simple as saying all democracies are our friend, and therefore, or can you just discern between maybe some who are regionally significant, they have special resources that we would need, there are unique attributes and skills that would make them attractive friends. And maybe as a follow-up to that, how do we shed friends who aren't, maybe there's a need to sort of discipline friends or to, you're not quite as important as we used to think you were. So how do you sort of rotate friends, so route some in and push other ones to the sidelines? I guess I could tell a little joke. Apparently, Mr. Trump really likes shaking the French president's hands, right? So was that handshake, that extended handshake, a sign of friendship or a sign of what was going on there with the treatment of Starmer and Macron this weekend?
Yeah, bro's definitely asserting dominance in those situations. Yeah, it's a good question because this administration does not take for granted what prior administrations since the 40s had taken for granted, which is that we have a certain set of friends, in quotation marks, and we call them friends, not just allies, but friends. And we want to expand that zone. And as it happens, all those friends are democracies and they're strategically important to us. So that was a kind of convenient way of thinking, but always in the back of our minds was, well, clearly the Americans also had an ABC policy in the Cold War, anything but communism. So we'll support dictators if they're on our side. But maybe we were more leery about calling them friends. I think the Saudis are a good example of a non-democracy that has been an American friend, in quotation marks, because the key here is that they're reliable, they're tractable in the sense that they will work with the U.S., they're flexible. That doesn't mean that they do everything the Americans want or like, but they're more willing to work with the U.S. And they're willing, both the Americans and the Saudis are willing to put things in context. So it's not worth letting the region spiral over Israel and Hamas, for example. They both tend to agree on that. And they're both very worried about the Iranians. So when you start overlapping reliability and accessibility on policy with a kind of geostrategic interest, that starts to look like somebody you can work with. Now, that said, every textbook on foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy I've ever read or looked at included principles or some version of principles as a part of American foreign policy, which is to say Americans are very concerned about being allied and partnered with other democracies. So I think that this administration is less concerned about. They don't talk about that as much, but that may be a kind of baseline view where we're at a low point with that. But I suspect there may be a return to some kind of idea that we're a democracy and we support other democracies, and we won't want to shake them off. Partly because they're successful and prosperous countries, so why would there's a kind of built-in interest there. Now, if they become basket cases, that's less convincing argument to make. But for the tradition is to be allied and friends with democracies because that's how we see ourselves. But I think, as Dr. Ramsey's question implies, that's not taken for granted like it used to be.
Yeah, I guess I agree with Dr. Shively. I think ideological resemblance is still important. Where Huntington wrote an article about the future of international conflict will be about conflict between civilizations, right? So countries with similar political systems, liberal democracy, competitive elections, more transparent, are more likely to be friends of the United States. But historically and traditionally, strategic alliances are also important, like with Saudi Arabia, even though we have very different political systems. Well, in terms of Trump, I think, as I said before, he takes more of a transactional approach to diplomacy and alliance building. I think he sometimes does prefer strongman, authoritarian leaders, as well, as long as they can make a deal. Well, yeah, I guess that makes sense in the short run, but in the long run, I think ideologies or democracy still matter.
It's a really fascinating question, and it's a really, really difficult question because, on the one hand, right, we're sort of hyper focused on US and China and just sort of thinking about those two states. But when we're sort of talking about this competition, in theory, it's global in nature. So, if we put all our attention in the Asia region, right, let's, be more friendly with Japan, be more friendly with South Korea, be more friendly with the ASEAN countries, right, in Southeast Asia, which I think we should. Right, do we leave behind Latin America now, right? Do we leave behind Sub-Saharan Africa, where we probably don't want to because we don't want China encroaching on those areas either? So it is a sort of a really difficult question. I do like the sort of question of, how do we sort of move from one ally to the next, right? It's not you, it's us, right? How do we sort of do that? I'm not sure. And I do think the more transactional, more sort of cynical approach to these things is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it can be useful to sort of look at, a country, right? You've been a great ally in the past. You're just not as important as somebody else now. We have to put more of our attention. But I would also argue that even if you're moving on from one alliance partner to the next, or one friendly state to the next, you don't have to take the one you're leaving behind and kick them. That's not necessary. And that's where I think we're sort of this shotgun approach with tariffs, right? That's kind of what we're doing. But sort of more directly in terms of, dealing with China, I would make sure that we have just such a strong bulwark of states in the sort of Southeast Asia, East Asia territory, right? Yeah, we're pretty good with South Korea, we're pretty good with Japan, but both are also pretty upset with us right now. You don't want to push that too hard, right? Start talking more to Singapore, Indonesia, these sorts of countries, because they can be very useful. Let's say China does make a move on Taiwan. Well, if we're friendly with all of these countries where Chinese shipping is going to have to come through to get them oil and other things, well, if we have friendly countries, we help them with submarines and stuff like that, right? They can wreak absolute havoc against the Chinese in some sort of open conflict. So we want to make sure, that they're on our side, because they can be very, very useful. But yeah, this is one of those sort of questions where who do we not want to be an ally with, right? We want everybody, because winning this sort of competition is having more friends than the other person. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure. It is a really, really great question, sort of thinking about it that way. But definitely enhance those relations in the region, and pull the Europeans along. It's good. Get them to start dealing with their own security, but once they're making that obligation, again, let's not sort of knock them after that. Sort of, a little more positive reinforcement here and there is probably a good thing.
I've noticed about once a week for a while now, we blow up a ship off of Venezuela's coast. Is this turning into something, or is it just going to stay at about this level? What's happening there, and does it have a connection to trying to remove Chinese influence from Latin America?
I'm a little well, I won't say baffled by this approach, because I think I understand it. It makes sense from Trump's point of view, because it looks tough and it's coming after a regime that he doesn't like in Venezuela, right? Most of these are happening off the coast of Venezuela. So there's been kind of a buildup of US naval assets. I heard some story this morning about, like, is this a prelude to an invasion or something? I'm skeptical of that. Trump has never displayed any interest in, like, sustained military, like a war, really, but he is okay with strikes, which makes him a little more bold in some ways. So he supported the Israelis when they attacked Iran. He killed Soleimani back in his first term, somewhat abruptly, sort of equivalent to killing the Joint Chiefs of Staff head or something like that. So really dramatic move. Most presidents wouldn't do that because they'd be afraid of escalation. But in Trump's mind, it's a one-off, and it worked in both of those cases. And I think he probably, my read after watching him for some time, is that he probably reads it in a similar way, that these are one-off actions that put pressure, that overlap several things for him. He can look tough. He's kind of militarizing against an enemy, but it doesn't entail a lot of long-term threat. In general, they're kind of wanting to use military forces against criminal threats. That's sort of the internally in the US and externally. So kind of that logic all flows together for him. Now it could, so bottom line, I don't think that he wants to escalate that necessarily, but it could nevertheless, right? Those are the sort of things you get your neck out and it gets chopped pretty quickly if you're not careful, or things get out of hand. The only other thing I'll add, though, is that this is completely illegal under international law, right? That's under any standard, you shouldn't be doing that if it's a criminal activity and you can interdict these ships without blowing them up. Now, they're also working in a long tradition of Americans using violence outside of international law. So both things can be true at once. It's not legal by, I think most international lawyers would agree, but it's also the type of thing that Americans have done in the past, whether they should or not, right? That's a separate discussion.
I don't know if it's going to be a thing or not. As Dr. Shively said, this is a good way to look tough, to do something. If we look back to the Soleimani strikes, and we look back to the Iranian strikes as part of the Israeli campaign against Iran not too long ago, sort of preceding those strikes were, sort of strains of thought going around that Trump was weak, Trump didn't want to do this, and he would just always back down whenever things were looking like they were getting tough. And this was sort of the response you get. And I think particularly when we've seen some of the sort of unpredictable back and forth on things like, threats about tariffs and going further with tariffs and imposing, even greater and stronger sanctions against Russia and then pulling them back very, very quickly, right? Those sort of same ideas start to come out again, right? He's just gonna pull back as soon as somebody pushes against him, and this might be sort of an outcome. That being said, the amount of chatter about the CIA now going into Venezuela, that's a little bit different. I think that signals that there might be the potential for things to escalate a little bit. Whether or not that ultimately means some maybe U.S. special forces in the region or not, maybe not. But I think the fact that we are hearing about the CIA potentially getting involved, like this is the 1960s and 70s and stuff like that, is pretty interesting. So I don't know what that means long term, and there might be a little bit more going on here than I think we appreciate.
Yeah, I'm not really sure like how effective this approach is gonna be in the long run. Well, definitely in the short term, it can cause some disruption, but in terms of overall effectiveness, like the impact on the drug flows, probably minimal. But it does generate a lot of publicity, right? It can boost domestic support for the Trump administration. But in the long run, I'm not sure this will be an effective measure in terms of countering drug traffics. As long as there is a market, there's profits, well, I guess drug flows is going to continue. I also wonder like how people in Latin America, they thought about this issue, right? I'm kind of curious the public opinion there.
Not only
Um,
that,
yeah.
not only that, we discount the fact of potential retaliation. For all of the border crackdowns we still have a relatively open border, and we still have these elements that do operate inside the U.S. Border. And so there is always the potential for backlash from these types of attacks. And I don't know how much validity there is, right? There's been talks of cartels starting to offer bounties for, ICE agents and people like that. I don't know if this is just chatter or things like that, but there is always the potential for this to go somewhere ultimately where we don't want it to go. Because if we know anything about cartels, they're not afraid of violence. Often very, very dramatic violence. And so that there's always the possibility of that happening here as well, and which could lead to greater potential escalation.
I'll add one thing, and I don't, because this topic is only, I'll add one short thing only because it extends this discussion a little more to new areas, which is there's some chatter that the incoming like national defense strategy or something like that is going to be focused on hemispheric defense or something along those lines, right? Where the administration is focused more on the Americas and less sustaining American global positioning around the world. And if that's true, right, what we see here with this Venezuela stuff is kind of a reorientation for whatever reason closer to home. The administration is skeptical of the United States as a global, active global power, and more interested in being globally powerful, but more narrowly focused on the use of that power.
Dr. Kim, you had in your introductory remarks, you had posed the suggestion that you can't really think about foreign policy without acknowledging the ways in which domestic policy constrains the ability of a nation to act. One of Mr. Trump's promises in the first term was to drain the swamp. And in my area of law, I do see that the court has lined up quite a docket. They've already had one victory on victory. The Trump administration got Chevron overturned. But this ability to maybe sort of fire at will within the bureaucracy, lay off federal workers while the government's shut down, is that going to have an impact, and maybe what kind, if it does, but of an impact on the ability of the United States to take action? I won't say wage war, take action. There might need to be some depth to the bureaucracy to sort of know what we're getting into. But it also, of course, bureaucracy can be stultifying, right, and slow you down and impede action.
What do you mean by action? Take action against whom? Like
Well,
foreign?
yeah, any kind of foreign action, a more assertive policy, like we're seeing from Mr. Trump sometimes. So where would it be? Well, maybe Venezuela, maybe the Middle East, but maybe also moving resources to more energetically defend, say, the Philippines, and positions in the East.
Yeah. Well, like targeting these traditionally independent agencies or bureaucrats, I think it's consistent with the populist platform, right? So these are considered as establishment, right? Part of the corrupt elite. Well, whether that can undermine U.S. strengths or capacity internationally? Well, I guess that depends. Well, what's the question again? Sorry.
Let me let's suppose that the court really does hand down some more decisions that really
Mm,
strengthen presidential authority over the bureaucracy, give him more ability to hire and fire at will. That means that you can expect a more responsive bureaucracy rather than one that can slow things down. So what kind of impact would that then have on American demonstrations of power in the international sphere?
Well, I guess from a bureaucratic perspective, well, traditional bureaucracy in democracies are modeled on Weberian bureaucracy, right? So a key feature of Weberian bureaucracy is political neutrality, hierarchy, division of labor to make it function efficient. But ironically, now people consider bureaucracy as something inefficient because there are so many rules and procedures, but these are originally designed to maintain neutrality and efficiency of bureaucracy. Well, a lot of countries have tried to reform bureaucracies, not just in the United States. They're trying to make it more efficient. Some countries, they try to borrow the organizational model from private companies and apply those to bureaucracies. But most of these reforms, they have relatively mixed results. In terms of the effects of bureaucratic change in the US, well, I think it's still too soon to make a judgment like what's going to be the long-term effect. But I do see it definitely, at least at a very top level, it does like undermine the neutrality, the Bavarian ideal of bureaucracy.
Yeah, I would argue that if this were to happen and the bureaucracy becomes less about merit and more about loyalty to a specific leader, I don't know how much it will impact international relations more so than it impacts domestic politics, right? The ability to take the bureaucracy and point it at somebody and use its full force, and to have a bureaucracy that says yes, sure, that I think becomes much more problematic, right? When you have a bureaucracy working for an individual rather than the state itself, this is when you start getting in the inefficiencies. This is when you start running into problems. And then this is when you run into having a bureaucracy that changes over every time you have a change in leadership. And in the long term, that's not a good thing. And it's a point I hammer home whenever I can. Strong bureaucracies, effective, efficient bureaucracy is a massive, massive source of power for states. And that's something I don't think we want to mess with haphazardly. The US, its great strength has been the bureaucracy and things like the IRS, and for it to function the way it does. And to go and sort of tear that down, I think will have long-term ramifications that I don't think a lot of people appreciate. So I think you're right, Dr. Ramsey. These are court cases that are very important for us to watch, and ultimately it will spill over into international politics as well.
Dr. Shively, we have a cybersecurity question. I have been rephrasing these questions. I liked the way this one was phrased, and so I'm just going to read it the way that it's written. Bear with me. There have been dozens of well-documented Chinese intrusions into U.S. critical infrastructure and systematic IP theft. And we know, as a matter of fact, that the U.S. itself engages in offensive cyber operations under doctrines such as defend forward or persistent engagement. However, unlike traditional wars, which compelled other states to centralize authority and develop further capacity, these cyber conflicts have tended to produce fragmented, decentralized responses. In your expert opinions, and we'll start with you first there, Dr. Shively, what could explain that gap?
Can you read back the latter half there?
I think the general sense is that usually when a nation is attacked, you would centralize resources to meet the threat. And it looks like maybe with the cyber thing, we still haven't really mastered the business of centralized threat detection and defense and offensive. It still looks like a fairly decentralized effort. Why would
Okay.
that be the case? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, so there was this period early on where people were freaked out about the idea of a cyber 9/11, for example, or cyber Pearl Harbor, where there would be some massive attack and shut down the U.S. Infrastructure, or in turn, some other government might worry about the U.S. doing that to the Americans, or the Americans doing that to them. What we have observed is that, empirically anyway, so far, cyber capabilities tend to be used for espionage and as an addendum to real world strikes. So the part of the reason it isn't centralized typically, we do have like Cyber Command, for example, but it doesn't quite get the same level of coherent resources. I think because it so far has been seen as an extra tool, rather than a theater in its own right. Now, it has been kind of reframed as a domain, like NATO switched to talking about cyber as a domain. The US does that, similar to air or land or whatever. But in practice, it's a bit like drones, which are a tool and they're increasingly important, but you wouldn't organize your entire assets around that one tool because a conflict is usually wider than that. So there's typically two things going on. Either cyber attacks and intrusions are more like old cat and mouse espionage type of game, or if they're part of a larger conflict, well, then there will be attacks, but why don't you just blow up the transformer or the railroad or whatever, right? And that does longer lasting damage than some 0-day exploit. So I think, yeah, it's a kind of pernicious question because everybody's like, this is definitely a big thing. And you would expect a lot of centralized resources because you can imagine it being used in a very devastating way. But in practice so far, that it tends to be used in more limited and specific ways as an addendum to other types of attacks or behaviors.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. I think, Dr. Shively, that's a very, very good answer. Right. So when we think of sort of war in the traditional sense as sparking centralization and state development and all that, you know, it tends to be from major wars, big wars, a lot of things blowing up, and unfortunately, a lot of people dying. That really kind of forces the state into taking these sort of more dramatic actions leading to centralization. And as Dr. Shively noted, right, we have the potential, right? Cyber operations have the potential to really mess us up. We just haven't seen that yet. And so I think until we unfortunately witness it, right, you're not going to get the public response necessary to go ahead and lead to that upper level centralization. Because I don't think the state can just engage in sort of a high level of centralization if they don't have some element of public support. And in terms of cyber operations, at this point in time, I think the sad reality is most of us are just blasé about it. Yeah, we know it's out there, but I know tomorrow or next week I'm going to get another letter in the mail saying my information was hijacked because of some hacking attack. I'm going to go, happened again. That sucks. And you just sort of move on, versus an attack that shuts down an entire healthcare system or an attack that shuts down our entire electric grid. That's going to be what's going to be necessary to sort of shock people into supporting upper level centralization. And I like Dr. Shively, that sort of, it's a cat and mouse sort of spy thing, up until this point. And so maybe that's why it hasn't sort of sparked what we would expect traditional warfare to spark.
I think Dr. Shively and Dr. Crisher have covered most points. Well, yeah, compared to conventional attacks, cyber strikes can be more decentralized, well, by the nature of cyber strikes, right? So in terms of targets, it focuses more on networks, software, or communication system. These systems themselves are decentralized. Also, in terms of visibility, right, it's often covert and can be launched by individual or small number of people. In terms of effect, sometimes it's reversible, as Dr. Shively mentioned. if you have backup, right, you can recover quickly. Well, in terms of scale, right, compared to conventional attack, cyber strikes can either target the entire system, as Dr. Crisher mentioned, right, like public health system, but sometimes can be like more localized attacks. So yeah, all these kind of make it more decentralized compared to conventional attacks.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. You know, I always enjoy these panels because I like hearing from you on these things. Thanks to our audience for asking several good questions I didn't even get to ask. They were good questions. I just ran out of time. And we will do this again next year, if not sooner. Have a good night.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night, all. Good
Good
luck,
night.
Jacob.
Good night. Thanks.